If there's one thing I loved about this era of gaming, it's that you got to see the origins of some truly fantastic game studios. Whilst in their infancy and typically with smaller teams, they're more capable of taking risks with games, trying to find something unique and not bound by their previous failures or successes. It can create some of the most memorable and well-loved games. Take for instance Sucker Punch, founded in 1997 in Washington by a group of ex-Microsoft employees. After realising their passion was in video games rather than software and engineering, they formed the studio despite the fact that only one of them had ever worked on a video game before. After choosing the name because one of their wives hated the name the most, Sucker Punch were in business and started work on their first game project. After 2 years of development and Ubi Soft agreeing to publish the game, landing on store shelves in late 1999 came Rocket Robot on Wheels. Whilst this falls into the crowded platform game genre, don't let that fool you. This is one of the most unique and interesting platform games on the system, and if you haven't played it before, well, you're in for a treat. The story begins as Dr. Gavin is winding down one evening, the night before the grand opening of Whoopie World. It's a strange futuristic blend of a zoo, an amusement park and a theme park. Dr. Gavin heads out to a party, leaving Rocket, his trusted assistant in charge of ensuring that nothing goes wrong before the grand opening, and most importantly that the park's two mascots are kept safe. Those caged mascots may look familiar for fans of Sly Cooper, because Jojo the Raccoon is a clear glimpse of the games the studio would eventually produce. Back to the story however, and after the Doctor leaves, Jojo starts his plan to turn Whoopie World into Jojo World, and he makes his escape, kidnapping Whoopi in the process. When Rocket wakes up after his assault, he begins his race against time to rescue Whoopi, free the captured animals, gather all of the stolen ride tickets, and of course capture Sly Cooper Sr. For a first time studio, this is a cool concept and one which I felt instantly gave the game perspective despite it being somewhat generic. But like most good platform games of the time, Rocket Robot on Wheels offers a great deal of freedom in terms of the level structure, whilst retaining the tropes which have been proven winners for 3D platform games. The first of 7 worlds gently breaks you into the game and naturally really serves to break you into the game's overall controls. It also gives you the template for which every future world will follow. The objectives in each world are generally non-linear, which helps the pacing of the game because if you get stuck on one task you can always just try a different one and come back to it later. That is perhaps one of the game's greatest strengths. The levels are not only all unique, but also have a wide range of submission tasks and mini-games which is fantastic. Typically in every level you'll have objectives which test your platforming skills. You'll have fetch quests, races and puzzles to solve. They'll all blend together in the same style as Banjo-Kazooie, creating a seamless level design which I adored. In a nice additional touch, each level also has a vehicle type section, be it a flying motorbike or jumping inside of a strange robotic style dolphin. The 7 worlds also steer away from the generic tropes and instead fit in wonderfully with the overall amusement park theme of the game. The worlds range from cloud-filled islands to flying carpet fantasy lands. They all have their own distinctive art style, which makes this not only look great, but also feels fresh to play, as you'll eagerly be awaiting the next new level to unlock. Perhaps the biggest point of note however in this game is the key concept which much of the game is built around, and that's the incredible physics-based engine. Every platform, area to traverse and object to be moved has perhaps the best physics behind them of any N64 console game. It's fundamental to the core concept of the game, and for a first time studio they did an incredible job. And because of that, the game does take some getting used to. It's difficult to explain, but when you're used to so many other 3D platformers on the console all playing fairly similar to one another, going and playing Rocket Robot on Wheels will be quite the experience. The momentum of your character and the balance of the platforms is a breath of fresh air, and when you're so used to the somewhat stiff and motionless areas of many N64 platform games. The best way to describe this comes from the game studio themselves. When they started work on Rocket, their goal was to create a 3D platform game where the character is secondary to the environments that they are interacting with. The studio felt so strongly about this that they described the game to the press early on as Bugs Bunny meets Isaac Newton. You'll need to use physics, inertia and mass to work your way through the game, which was groundbreaking for the time on a home console. Every item, enemy, platform and object in the game has its own unique weight and feel when handling them. One of Rocket's main abilities is that he can use a mini tractor beam to manipulate most things around him. This creates a whole new world of puzzles in the game because you'll need to think like a physicist in order to complete some of the game's trickier tasks. This alone may create problems for some gamers because quite honestly, this is certainly a thinking man's platform game because the studio reduces the overall speed of the game to make this clear. Whereas in platform games such as Super Mario 64, you'll often have to make quick decisions and snap movements. Rarely does Rocket ramp up the pace in this regard. Instead, you'll have more than enough time for trial and error without the worry of enemies hampering your progress. Don't worry however, as a quick trip to the hint screen in the pause screen, you can get a glimpse and a hint about what you need to be doing without spoiling the overall game by it stating the obvious. Being published by Ubi Soft, many magazines of the time made an unfortunate comparison between the graphics of this game and Ubisoft's biggest game of 1999, which was Rayman 2. Considering that different studios created the games, it was unfair in my opinion, and naturally Rocket is not quite up there with the quality of Rayman 2's visuals. And by being released in the same year, it meant that Rocket may have slipped through the radar for many gamers. But don't be fooled, because I personally think that Rocket is a great looking game. There's none of that horrible blurriness that many associate with N64 games. There's next to no pop-up and the texture quality is good enough. I say that because whilst the studio could have improved on some of these textures, it no doubt would have come at a sacrifice of the frame rate. Thankfully this is never an issue in Rocket, and in the many hours of playing it from start to finish, rarely did the frame rate drop noticeably or hinder the gameplay. I love the wash of bright colours in the game and the overall tone is just so eye-catching. The characters are not quite as memorable aside from the main character Rocket, but as we know from later Sucker Punch games, they'd quickly improve on their character design in future games. It's worth noting as well that all of this is without the expansion pack support, and when you consider again that this is the studio's first title, it in some way puts many other studios to shame. With so much happening in the game's physics department, the overall controls certainly needed to be near perfect, and I would say that they generally are. Although the N64 analog stick is known for its harshness, the overall handling of the game compensates well for this. With so many tricky puzzles to solve and many requiring pinpoint accuracy, there are very few times where I blame the handling rather than my own abilities when I messed up. With Rocket moving on a singular pivot point at the bottom of his wheel, throwing him around quickly becomes second nature and you'll pick it up in no time at all. As much as I hate to be a negative Nancy, the game's audio really isn't great. The music loops far too frequently, and although I generally have a fondness for jazz-inspired soundtracks, this one isn't great. The heavy use of organs in the score really begins to grate on your ears, especially as it loops over and over again, and if you're stuck in one of the game's many difficult tasks it can become distracting, and there's no way to turn it down whilst keeping the effect levels up. The effects on the other hand are nicely done and are used sparingly. Thankfully once you've collected tickets and items in a level they don't reappear, and so you're spared from having to hear the same sample repeat frequently like you do in other platformers. I would have given Rocket some more character by implementing additional noises to help get over some emotion in key areas of the game. For the most part he is a silent character, although I assume that this may have been done intentionally behind the studio's idea to make him secondary to the actual environments. Rocket Robot on Wheels has been one of the most requested videos on this channel for quite some time. Even when I started the channel years ago, I would frequently get people message me either asking me to cover it or to help them name the game because they remembered the unique style of it but couldn't quite find the title. In the same way that Space Station Silicon Valley captured gamers' imaginations back in the day, I feel that Rocket Robot on Wheels did this also. Looking back now, perhaps the biggest mistake that Nintendo made was not realising the true potential of the studio and snapping them up with a similar relationship to Rare. Just a few short months after the game's release, Sucker Punch was signed with Sony, and the rest is history as their next game was Sly Cooper, which I think would have been perfect for the GameCube. A lot was made when Rare was purchased by Microsoft, but just imagine if Nintendo had Sucker Punch to step up to fill their boots. Simply put though, if you like N64 as a console and platform games in general, then I can't see how you wouldn't love Rocket Robot on Wheels. From its humble beginning being known as Sprocket in development, until a few months before its release when the name was changed to Rocket, this game was always on my radar. It's one of the few times on the N64 where a game far exceeded my expectations, and even more staggering was again that this was from a first time debuting studio. And so for today's topic of conversation, I'd love to know what your favourite game from Sucker Punch is even to this day. I'd also love to know what franchises you'd have given Sucker Punch to work with if they had remained as a console game developer for Nintendo instead of jumping ship. As strange as this may sound, but I would have loved to have seen the studio working on Kid Icarus. As always though, let me know your memories, thoughts and feelings about Rocket Robot on Wheels in the comments section down below. And until next time.